to start my presentation by honoring the fact that in March of 1981, Bobby Sands started the hunger strike in Ireland, the Irish hunger strike, and as well as the Palestinian hunger strikes that continue, and as well as the hunger strikes that are happening in detention centers throughout the U.S. So I just want to honor that, but also acknowledge what a privilege it is to be thinking and writing through this important political practice, I think, that's happening right now in our moment. So, in 2004, CIA prisoner Majid Khan began hunger striking and self-mutilating. In response to Khan's refusal to eat, medical personnel began to force feed him both intravenously and through a nasogastric tube. According to records, Khan cooperated with the force feedings and even began administering the fluids and nutrients himself. Despite Khan's cooperation, the CIA subjected him to involuntary rectal feedings and rectal hydration, which included 2 bottles of Ensure. Khan continued to hunger strike and engage in acts of self-harm that included attempting to cut his wrist on 2 occasions, an attempt to chew into his arm at the inner elbow, an attempt to cut a vein in the top of his foot, and an attempt to cut into his skin at the elbow joint using a file toothbrush. So Khan was captured in Pakistan by the CIA in 2003, and he was taken to a Cobalt detention site in Afghanistan, which is where this narrative of self-mutilation and hunger striking takes place. And then in 2006, he was transferred to Guantánamo Bay, where he still is being held captive. So where this narrative comes out of is the Senate Report on Torture, which some of you might read about or read. It was published in 2014 and is the declassified version that's published is about 800 pages long, and the classified version is like 1,600 pages. And there's talk that it's going to be published, I don't know, in the future, but it was compiled in an attempt to make public the torture of the CIA interrogation program, which was dismantled in 2009. So in the larger project, what I'm trying to do is read this very long report that's also, the language of the report is extremely oppressive and bureaucratic and dehumanizing, where it understands these practices of hunger striking and self-mutilation as bureaucratic nuisances that are like, if things had just gone more smoothly, we wouldn't be having to deal with this. And so in reading Khan's narrative, I was struck by how this is a very real moment that I think in this report, this state report, where you really see the struggle of racialized bodies and how racialized bodies continue to speak back to state management. So that's part of a different project where I'm reading different kinds of state report and manuals and trying to think about like what the body tells us that the state is constantly trying to silence. So to that end, Khan's narrative has 3 important movements. Khan begins to hunger strike, military personnel begin to force feed him, and Khan's self-harm becomes more aggressive. At play here is the tension between the state's suppression of Khan's political transgression through force feeding and Khan's continued resistance to such tactics. The Senate Intelligence Committee on Torture characterizes Khan's hunger strike and acts of self-mutilation as psychological and behavioral issues representative of the CIA's mismanagement and failure to ethically extract intelligence from captives of the war on terror. I argue, however, that Khan's self-directed violence is a political strategy that instrumentalizes the body in order to speak back to state technologies of management, confinement, and torture. Khan's acts of self-harm serve as a reminder that for over a decade, the political agency of hunger striking, as a response to U.S. captivity, has been compromised by technologies of torture, such as the feeding tube. So I think in the artist talk we just saw that was so amazing, we get to see the more pleasurable sides of technology, which is a nice reminder, which is not what I do, unfortunately. And in 2002 marked the beginning of what would be referred to as rolling hunger strikes at Guantánamo Bay Naval Base. Released prisoners reported that the hunger strike began in response to the mistreatment of the Quran by a military police police officer in Camp X-Ray, and Camp X-Ray no longer exists now. Incidences leading up to the fast included officers stomping, kicking, and throwing the Quran at prisoners. After 8 days, a senior officer apologized, assuring that this wouldn't happen and the Quran wouldn't be disrespected or touched again. This was the beginning of 2002, but by the end of February, another hunger strike began after an officer removed a homemade turban from a prisoner during his prayer. Over the next couple of months, the strike would include the participation of 194 prisoners and would be articulated as a protest prompted by indefinite detention of prisoners, harsh living conditions, and religious intolerance. Although a public affairs officer stated at the time that tensions at the camp had eased and that the hunger strikes were in no way organized, by mid-March, several prisoners who had refused food and water for 2 weeks were forcibly fed. Military officials acknowledged at this point that the prisoners were, quote-unquote, protesting their murky future. I don't presume the hunger strikes at Guantánamo to be a wholly intelligible act to the populace outside of it. Rather, my conceptualization of the practice seeks to grapple with the performativity of the hunger strikers' self-starvation and push beyond simple rationalizations of the practice as a desperate last resort to one's political and social demands. Patrick Anderson's So Much Wasted is useful in considering how hunger striking functions as political performance. For Anderson, hunger striking is a form of embodied political performance that sacrifices one's own corporeal integrity. Hunger striking is also a productive act in that there are goals that collective strikers wish to meet. The constant rearticulation of demands becomes ritualized, allowing for both transparency and relevancy. This iterative quality of striking is durational. On this, Anderson writes, defined most simply as a refusal to eat, hunger striking is actually a continuing form of abstinence, one that extends beyond the moment of its origin through and across periods of normative and in state interventions forced alimentary exchange. It becomes itself not simply at the moment of the declarative, I choose not to eat, but also when that refusal is reiterated through time. I agree that the power of hunger striking is the iterative form it takes, but I would also add that what the Guantánamo strikes demonstrate is an intensification of the act over time and a kind of compounding of the body's threshold for suffering. Indeed, this echoes back to Khan's movement from hunger striking to self-mutilation to suicide attempts from which I began. This movement speaks to the intensely physical nature of hunger striking, yet it also extends beyond the materiality of the body. Self-starvation in the context of confinement can be understood as the phenomenological price one's body must pay in order to move towards political transformation. Banu Bargu calls this paradox the weaponization of life, whereby the body is a necessary intermediary to achieving certain political ends, at the same time that its necessary destruction defies the distinction between means and ends and obliterates instrumental rationality. The metaphysical aspect of the weaponization of life is situated in a conception of life that prioritizes the life of a political cause over the biological existence of its proponents. So there's something about the act that is actually kind of paradoxical to a kind of liberal sensibility of the wholeness of the body and trying to keep the body from harm and from suffering. Foucault in Discipline and Punish writes that at the heart of the emergence of technologies of punishment in the 18th and 19th centuries was the technology of the body. It is always the body that is at issue, the body and its forces, their utility and their docility, their distribution and their submission. What we see in the Guantánamo hunger strikes is the transformation of bodies, but not simply via supervision, surveillance, and docility, but rather the captives of the war on terror demonstrate the ways that one's corporeal subjugation is the condition of possibility for political strategizing. The prison cell is clearly an obstacle, yet to put one's own interiority, but to pull from one's own interiority pushes one to reconsider freedom and unfreedom while confined spatially to the cell and invested within the state apparatus, to quote Alec Feldman. So to choose not to eat can be intensified depending on the political and spatial form it takes. This is most apparent in the prison's management and discipline of the prisoner's body through the separation of cells, of bodies and cells, a process which works to produce incapacitation through stillness, silence, and idleness of the body. Arguably, it was the tactic of incapacitation amidst the mistreatment of the Quran that prompted the first mass suicide attempt in 2002 at Guantánamo, with 23 prisoners attempting to kill themselves by hanging themselves in their cells. None of the prisoners died, but out of the 23, the military categorized only 2 as quote-unquote genuine suicide attempts and labeled the rest as manipulative, self-injurious behavior. And in the language of interrogation and detention, this is actually its own category that interrogators are taught about, like the psychology of this kind of manipulation that they say. So put differently, these so-called manipulative acts were represented as merely a collective effort to disrupt camp procedures and to protest a new group of security guards. In June of 2006, Guantanamo authorities reported that 3 prisoners had used bed sheets to hang themselves in their cells. Commanding Officer Harris famously called the suicides asymmetrical warfare against Guantanamo as an institution, which is interesting because in some ways it acknowledges that this isn't some kind of like psychopathological act of depression, but that there's an actual kind of war happening between the prisoners and the institution of Guantanamo. The successful suicides of these prisoners are examples of death unregulated by the nation state. Such finality and pain, Barbu notes, are acts of corporeal, existential, and total resistance and refusals to participate in one's own dehumanization. Unsurprisingly, following the suicides, the number of prisoners hunger striking shrank and tube feedings intensified. Although self-starvation shifts the power dynamics of the prison, it is nonetheless imperative to question what happens to the agency of pain and the sovereignty of the body in the wake of force feeding. So, I mean, it's interesting with Guantanamo because almost in some ways it seems like, oh, force feeding began in 2013 with an intensification of hunger striking, but I mean, the reality is from the very beginning in 2002, hunger striking was met with force feeding. So this kind of struggle of political transgression in the camps is from the very beginning, and it's something in the larger project that I have to attend to and think through. So by 2008, it was reported that there were only 10 active hunger strikers, and that twice a day a feeding tube was inserted into each prisoner's nose. In 2009, numbers rose to include between 42 and 70 prisoners on strike. 2013 marked the beginning of the most significant strike to date, with 106 out of 168 prisoners striking in confinement. New procedures for force feeding had been introduced in 2009 and included strapping detainees to a chair, forcing a tube down their throats, feeding them large quantities of liquid nutrients and water, and leaving them in the chair for as long as 2 hours to keep them from purging the food. And this is according to prisoners' accounts and military officials. Prisoners reported to their attorneys that at a certain point it was pointless to resist tube feedings. Regardless of whether prisoners cooperated or not, the tubes only got bigger, and both insertion and removal were equally as painful. All of this is in stark contrast to Guantanamo officials asserting that medical personnel do not insert nasogastric tubes in a manner intentionally designed to inflict pain. Indeed, strong critiques have been lodged against the practice of force feeding and the medical ethicality of administering the feeding tube when the World Medical Association's Declaration of Tokyo prohibits it. So a lot has been kind of written about the medical ethics of it. In 2002, the Daily Telegraph wrote that 2 hunger strikers had been attached to intravenous drips to halt dehydration and were unable to remove the drips due to being handcuffed to their beds. There will be no Bobby Sands-style martyrs at America's controversial Camp X-Ray, stated Charles Lawrence, who's a journalist for the Daily Telegraph. And it's also interesting in all of the literature about Guantanamo's hunger strikes is that there's a recapitulation of the 1981 strike in Ireland. So here he's invoking the fact that Bobby Sands was the first to die at the hunger strike in Ireland, and that after him, 9 more men died. Indeed, the famous Irish hunger strike showcased not only the weaponization of the body's interiority and exteriority, but also a commitment to fast unto death. By the inception of the 81 strike, Bobby Sands knew with certainty that it would take not only his death, but also the death of other strikers in order for the British government to concede to their demands. Death in the hunger strike, writes Feldman, was conceived as both the literal termination of biological functions and the countdown, the long drawn-out socio-biological death that the endurance of starvation dramatically stretched into an iconic act of historical mediation. This idea of going to the edge was reaching the cusp of history. It was the creation of a new socio-temporal continuum arising out of the biological time of the dying prisoner. So this concept was not only a way to articulate death, and this is a concept that the Irish Republicans formulated themselves, that they called death going to the edge, was not only a way to articulate death, but also a way for the Republican striker to apprehend a kind of radical openness to a different world. Resistance to the hegemonic allure predicated upon making live is ultimately the conditions of possibility underwriting hunger striking. Indeed, such a rupture to the biopolitical functioning of the state destabilizes modern sovereignty. President Obama, however, continues to support the forced feeding of prisoners because he doesn't want to see anyone die. This speaks not only to the emphasis of life, but the regulation of death and the capacity of the state to prohibit political protest through the apparatus of the feeding tube, effectively congealing medical technology and carceral discipline. This rhetoric of life summons Foucault's account of biopower and society must be defended. If biopower's function is to make live, posits Foucault, then how can it let die? State racism as a form of biopower is, for Foucault, what sutures sovereignty, discipline, and security together, at once adhering to power's objective of making live at the same time that it centers death. For Foucault, state racism is about elimination, but force feeding at Guantánamo Bay is not about elimination, I argue, but about the incapacitation of the body, the spirit, and political transgression in a narrative forms. Force feeding as a biopolitical technique then makes live, but it is an incapacitated form of life devoid of consent and self-actualization. Ultimately, to engage with the state and medical establishment's complicity with the management of the body highlights the paradox inherent to modern liberalism's dedication to the elimination of pain and suffering through war and torture. Expanding upon this paradox, Bargu is correct to assert that what frames modern forms of governance is both thanatopolitics, suicide, as well as biopolitics, and calls the assemblage of practices where both life and death are made into objects of knowledge, biosovereignty. No doubt this concept is useful in terms of thinking about the discourses and practices, signs, and actions that define the power regime that currently emerges at the intersection of different modalities of power, says Bargu, and produces techniques of war such as force feeding, but I want to suggest that the effects of such techniques are better apprehended as practices of incapacitation rather than death. Ruth Gilmore's Golden Gulag informs my emphasis on incapacitation, and her argument that isolation and immobility were central to the California prison boom beginning in the 70s. Jasper Puar's work on maiming is likewise generative. Puar makes the case that the corporeal debilitation of Palestinians functions as will not let die and will not make die. The straddling between life and death is particularly resonant with force feeding and the ways that it inhabits a liminal space between freedom and captivity. The question then is how to attend to the state's regulation of life via force feeding and what Alex Wahilier describes as the importance of minuscule movements, glimmers of hope, scraps of food, the interrupted dreams of freedom found in those spaces deemed devoid of human life. This returns us to the hunger strike of Majid Khan, from which I began. Rather than read Khan's actions as purely resistive or agentive, it is perhaps more productive to read Khan's bodily self-harm as making visible what the law masks, to conjure Colin Diane's words. This is both a call and an opportunity to engage with the history of the present, a present saturated with bodies, demanding a new political reality that may or may not be possible in this world, but the actions of which exceed the present in order to commit to the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have time for a couple questions once again.
With the closing of Guantánamo, or supposed that push towards it, where do you see the force feeding go? Do you see a change in geographical locations being a change in that the sort of policies that Obama's? I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's an interesting question actually, because from what I've been reading recently is that if it does close, which I'm actually not convinced that it will, the prisoners who have not been cleared for release will just be transported to prisons in the U.S. So this kind of continuum between the territory of Guantanamo and U.S. carceral logics will just continue, and it really will just kind of move indefinite detention into U.S. prisons. So, but what that means for force feeding is really a good and important question, and like terrifying to imagine, and I don't know. So.
Thank you so much.